Hey guys, thanks for joining me on YouTube again. I wanted to talk a little bit about my history as an artist, but first I thought I'd mention a few things about portrait sculpting. Um, I wanted to discuss like the importance of observation when you're sculpting. Something that Steve Lord stressed was sculpting what you see and not what you think you see. I think a lot of artists learning ZBrush sell themselves short when they use image planes to try to trace portraits. You lose out on a lot of depth and understanding of geometry when you do that because it is like tracing. I mean, you might get the profile of the nose or the position of the eyes and the head correct, but when it comes to turning the forms at like the three-quarter view of the face, it doesn't work. It You're selling yourselves short, and you have to become a proficient sculptor, a proficient portrait sculptor, like a lot of the guys that we admire. You've got to force your eye to observe and then translate that observation to what you have in front of you as far as sculpting, whether it's oil clay or wax or ZBrush, all the same rules apply. I've used those image planes to check like the profile of the nose once I have the shape blocked in, but you can't rely on it. You can't, it's so important that you force your mind and your eye and your hand to all coordinate using your powers of observation. And one of the best ways to do this is simply by grabbing a mirror and sculpting a self-portrait, or getting your friends to sit for you or your family members. And in the end, what it all boils down to is hard work. Like, I can guarantee you that like a portrait sculptor like Frank Seng, he's an amazing portrait sculptor, and I'm pretty certain he didn't get where he is by using image planes and ZBrush to trace his portrait work. He's got a really fantastic understanding of basic form in the human face, and another, Steve Lord, same way. Like, no, no cheating, just constant hard work and powers of observation. The other thing that I wanted to mention is like I would urge a lot of you to like avoid jumping into detailing too quickly. Like, I know that like sculpting skin pores and like wrinkles and around the eyes and stuff is it's fun and it brings the portrait to life, but don't jump into it too early. Uh, Really try to understand the basic geometry of the human face first. Get the planes laid out, get the basic forms blocked in, and then work on like the subtleties of around the nose and like in the corners of the eyes and the mouth. Those things are all so important to do before you start putting skin pores on or crow's feet at the edges of the eyes, because without, it's the typical old analogy, like without the cake you can't put the icing on it. It's not gonna work. So I would urge you to just approach it kind of old school, use your powers of observation and really work the anatomy and the proportions and the planes. And this goes for everything in sculpting, not just head sculpting, but the body as well. um, Anyway, just my 2 cents on sculpting and portrait work. I did want to talk some about my history as an artist. I think it's something that is cool to do, and I would love to hear other people discuss their history coming up into the entertainment field, because we see all these amazing images on the internet, of these artists that we admire, and it kind of glosses over where they came from. You never get like an image of the personality behind the artwork. You just see like this amazing render, and then it's like you don't understand that the struggle that led them up to that point, that there's this entire history behind that person of failed sculpts and client rejections and all kinds of turmoil that led up to that point. And I think it's important for young artists to hear those things, because again, you get this glossed over image of these artists that you admire, and sometimes it can be very disheartening because you just think like, oh man, I'm never going to get there. But the truth is, it all boils down to hard work. You just have to stick to what you love, and you can't give up no matter what kind of roadblocks are thrown in your way. You just got to keep working and working. Um, and I would love to hear other people talk about their experiences. I find it extremely fascinating. But as for myself, I grew up outside Philadelphia, and I went to the Academy of Fine Arts in Philly, where I received a very classical training in. I majored in figurative sculpting there. And when I graduated, I had a pretty decent understanding of basic proportion and anatomy, but I was sculpting in water clay, and this would have been in like 2002 or 3, I think. And all the toy companies at the time, the collectibles companies, were using wax. And I found that out very quickly because, to make a long story short, I did apply to McFarlane Toys, and they gave me a shot. But I was sculpting. I think all my portfolio pieces for McFarlane were in oil clay, so they urged me to go home and work for like another 3 months to try to learn wax. And I did. I picked it up. It was rough. It was a difficult process, but I finally got it and came back, and they gave me an opportunity to work in their studio for $12 an hour. And this was like right outside Manhattan, and that area of North Jersey is not inexpensive. So, I had to take what they offered because I'm a naive, inexperienced artist with, no background in anything. So I had to look at it as an opportunity, and I moved in with a couple guys. Actually, one of them, Craig Campbell, who ended up working at Weta, and Brian Fay, who is now the lead sculptor at Blizzard's collectibles studio. We all worked for McFarlane Toys at the same time. Alex Heinke was there as well. He now works with NECA. Later on, Dave Silva got hired there. He's now at NECA. But there have been a whole slew of artists that came through McFarlane's doors that moved on to other things. And I was very fortunate to be part of that and have that opportunity. It was not easy. Again, the salary was like pennies on the dollar for that area. And when you started at McFarlane, you didn't just jump into like sculpting awesome monsters and Spawn figures. I remember the president, Ed Frank, told us all that when you got hired there, it was like sculpting boot camp, and he wasn't lying because, man, you got put through the ringer. Like I said, we weren't sculpting monsters right off the bat at that place. Like we sculpted a lot of like accessories for stuff. McFarlane was really heavy into the sports figures at the time, so we sculpted endless amounts of shoes and baseball gloves, and you know started working our way slowly into drapery and stuff. Um, but it was an uphill battle. And one of the things I should mention on a personal level is that I took a lot of it for granted at the beginning. I had a different attitude about the stuff when I graduated college. I really wanted to be a fine artist, and working in the collectibles industry was kind of like option B for me. And when I got hired at McFarlane, I really took it for granted. And it became evident right away within the first year that guys like my young workmates there, like Brian and Alex, were moving up that ladder faster than I was because I didn't take it seriously. I just looked at it like a job, like I was using my skills for a trade to make a living, and that was it. But I recall what Gene St. Jean said. He was the sculpting supervisor at the time. Again, an amazing artist who now works primarily for DC. But he said that the guys that are successful in this industry are the ones that go home and continue their trade after they walk away from their desk at work. And that's what guys like Alex and Brian were doing. They were going home and working more and learning more on their own. And I was just going home and like I had a girlfriend at the time and like I just wanted to go to the shore and party or whatever, and I wasn't applying myself. And I eventually fell really far behind, and it actually got to the point where, Gene came to me and said, you're blowing it, basically. You've got talent, but you're not applying yourself, and we're watching you. So I had to take it seriously. I had to make a decision to buckle down and really focus on trying to better myself as an artist, not just at the office, but outside of work as well. And I eventually did. I caught on and caught up to everybody, and we uh we eventually, like, the young guys that I was hired with, we eventually filled the shoes of the older artists that had moved on to other things, and within like 5 or 6 years we were the senior sculptors at McFarlane Toys. And by then, yeah, we were sculpting all the cool stuff, the Spawn figures that everybody loved so much, and like 12-inch statues and all that cool stuff. So it paid off. And again, it boiled down to just applying myself and working really hard. But even after that, it wasn't all like rosy. Because right around that time, after I'd been at McFarlane for about 6 years, the economy tanked, and my wife and I had just bought a house and came into work one day, and the new sculpting supervisor, Mike Gullen, had to gather everybody around his office and tell us all that we were being laid off, nearly down to a man. In fact, the only person that McFarlane Toys kept on full time on their full time sculpting staff was Steve Lord, because he had again, this is where being like having some insight and like pushing yourself to learn new things paid off, because Steve was the only person in the sculpting department that forced himself to learn ZBrush. And they could see, management at the time could see that the way the industry was headed, that digital modeling was going to be more cost effective and efficient. So Steve went home and learned the stuff, and when the crap hit the fan, the entire sculpting department got laid off. I'm not kidding. It was like, I don't know, 13, 14 people at the time. Um, all of us, every one of us, except Steve, got laid off. And it was heartbreaking because my wife and I had just closed on a house 3 months before. So you can imagine the amount of stress that caused. It was miserable. But it also lit a fire under my butt, because I could see right away that the only way that I was going to be able to remain relevant in the industry was to go home and learn ZBrush. And it was brutal, because at the time everybody was stressed out, and a lot of guys that knew ZBrush weren't really open to sharing information, because they were, and I don't know if I can really blame them. Like, I thought it was kind of like, selfish, but you got to understand, I guess, that they were trying to hang on to their jobs, and there was a lot of competition in the field for a very, very few amount of jobs. So, I had to take it upon myself to learn a lot of things, and it was not easy. Making the transition, a lot of people have had an easy time picking up ZBrush, but I think my traditional sculpting actually initially really worked against me, because I was so used to having that facile feel for something like in my hands that I could hold and manipulate. Like, the hand-eye coordination was, sculpting clay was very natural for me. ZBrush was like, man, it was awful. Like, not just the hand-eye coordination, but like the user interface was so confusing. Um, it was a brutal learning curve. But eventually I started to pick up on it, just basically watching YouTube videos for hours and hours during the day, and, picking up bits of pieces of information from ZBrush Central and the few people that were willing to answer questions about things. I eventually picked it up and started like doing kind of serious portfolio projects, because keep in mind, I knew that to get back into the industry I was going to have to go digital, and I eventually managed to do it, but I had to rebuild a digital portfolio. and it was brutal. But it was about 3 years later, and I had gotten proficient enough at ZBrush that I actually resubmitted my portfolio to McFarlane because things had kind of calmed down and they were talking about maybe bringing a few people on. And I was fortunate enough that like my timing was right and I had learned just enough ZBrush to get back into the studio. And again, like moving wasn't really an option for me at the time. A lot of my friends, like Brian, by that point had already left for California. But I had a house and I was upside down on my mortgage, and I couldn't leave North Jersey. So I really only had one option, and that was McFarlane Toys. Um, because I had a rapport with them and they trusted me as a sculptor. Once I learned ZBrush, they invited me back. So I stayed there for another few years, and in the meantime, I had some like really heavy personal stuff going on. My marriage fell apart. My wife did not have the same vision for our future that I did, and she kind of screwed things up for us, and it just kind of went down in flames without going into too much detail. And I had to make some really, really hard decisions because, of course, we still owned the house, and I still had the job at McFarlane. But by that point, as much as I appreciated the job opportunity at McFarlane, I could kind of see that it wasn't really going anywhere. It was a skeleton crew, and there was no real opportunity for like any upward movement in the company. I could see that it was a dead end. So I tried to make lemonade out of lemons, if you will, and use the bad thing going on in my personal life to try to like springboard myself into something completely new. And to go back a little bit, once I had become proficient with ZBrush, and I was still like searching for jobs outside of McFarlane. I had hooked up with a small company owned by a guy named Arham Raja. It was called ARH Studios, and he was in desperate need of sculptors. So, because he was trying to grow his company, so I offered him my portfolio, and I had done a few things for him in wax while I was still laid off from McFarlane Toys, and it was a huge anchor for me. It was really good because I needed the money and I needed to keep my sculpting skills going. So he offered me that opportunity, and we kind of stayed in touch even after I got rehired at McFarlane. He really wanted to use me as a digital artist. So I did one project for him, a freelance project. I sculpted a Minotaur for him while I was at McFarlane. And once I kind of broke down for him my personal situation, I had sculpted a few other things for him, including the Death Dealer that was on display at Comic-Con in 2014. I explained to him my personal situation, that I really didn't want to be with McFarlane Toys anymore, and I didn't want to live in North Jersey, and I was getting a divorce. He actually, on the spot at Comic-Con, once he saw the positive reaction to the Death Dealer, invited me to move to Idaho and help him grow his company. So, long story short, that's where I ended up. I packed my bags, I threw all my sculpting equipment and stuff in a pod and moved 2,400 miles across the country because I just needed a fresh start and I saw an opportunity to help a small company grow. So at this point, I am now the lead artist and creative director for ARH Studios. And, again, like the point of all this being that none of it came easily. It's still not easy on a day-to-day basis. Like I've still gotta like be very disciplined because I am really the only sculptor that goes into the office every day. We work with some freelancers, but I have to call my own shots. I have to be like very brutal about my own schedule. Um, but none of this stuff came easy. All of it, it all comes down to hard work and sacrifice and what you are willing to put into your career. Um, so my advice for all the young guys trying to break into this industry, whether it's movies or video games or trying to pick up sculpting gigs, you just have to keep working. And like no matter what kind of obstacles get thrown in your way, you've got to stay focused. Stay focused and keep working hard. Train your powers of observation. Really try to study as much as you can from the artists that you admire. I'll tell you right now that one of the best learning experiences that I ever had was copying old master portraits. I've done it both in ZBrush and in oil clay and in oil paint. Because a lot of times when you look at a really fantastic portrait, they have solved a lot of the simplification for you. So you can kind of like dismiss all the details, and they've broken down the face into its basic geometry already. So you can pick up a lot by copying those well-established artists. So again, there are some techniques to learning that I could share, but as far as like my history as an artist, obviously that's the abbreviated version. I hope I didn't bore all of you too much. Again, like I love this stuff. I would love to hear about what other people have gone through that have gotten them to where they are. I think it, like I said at the beginning, I think it's very encouraging for younger artists to hear this stuff because it's not always easy. It's not like you just jump in the pool and swim. Anyway, thanks for joining me. This portrait was something I did for ARH Studios as kind of like a generic head that I can work on top of and modify for other things. That's the magic of ZBrush, and you'll see this last still image here. I took this portrait and modified it and made it into a yelling expression, and this is something for an upcoming project. Thanks for joining me, guys.